Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this episode, you might consider subscribing. What I'm going to be talking about today is I'm going to be continuing with part 9 of my crazy wavy neck through guitar build that I'm working on. And what I'll be doing specifically is the work that you see that I've already done, which is to press in the frets. So let me invite you along as I do this work and you can see the process that I use to do this. Before I can start to press the frets into the fretboard, I need to make sure that the fretboard is perfect. It needs to be absolutely straight and flat, and the radius, which in this case is a 12-inch radius, needs to be consistent from end to end, from side to side. And it already started out in pretty good shape after cutting it on the CNC machine, but the act of clamping the fretboard down when I glued it to the neck can sometimes change its shape ever so slightly, and it's got to be perfect, because if I can carry perfection through from this stage through installing the frets to where I'm getting ready to level them, there's far less work to do. So to ensure that the fretboard is perfect, the first thing I have to do is make sure that the truss rod is in the neutral position. This is a two-way double action truss rod. So that's basically in the middle of its adjustment range where it's doing nothing. And once I have that set, I can check to see the condition of the fretboard with a precision straight edge. And it's pretty good in this case. But I did have some issues with the radius. I'm shooting for, like I said, a 12-inch radius, but there is a flat spot that was running down the center, and it was kind of turned down at the edge, so it was actually closer to a 10-inch radius. So to get it correct, I'm going to sand it with a radius sanding beam. And the beam that I use, this is one that I just made myself out of a slab of 1/2 inch thick. I think it's 4-inch wide or 3.5-inch wide, 18-inch long aluminum. And I cut this on my CNC machine, and what I have affixed to it is some 320 grit 3M sticky back sanding abrasive. And I could probably get the work done faster if I went down to 220 or maybe even 150 or 180. But 320 will take a little bit extra work, but it's going to mean less work later on as I get the fretboard finished sanded before installing the frets. So I'll start with the 320, and I'm just going to sand back and forth. Now this whole beam is really heavy, so I don't have to put a lot of force on it. I just let the weight of the beam do the work, and I use my hand to guide it back and forth. Now some guys will draw squiggly lines with graphite with like a pencil on the surface to gauge their progress. If you're new to this, I think that's fine to do, but I think more experienced luthiers tend to just avoid that, because it's pretty easy to tell just by looking at the fretboard where you're sanding and where you're not sanding. And in this case, I have this strip right down the center that hasn't been touched by the sandpaper yet. It's mostly hitting the edge. And sometimes you can also tell by looking at your sandpaper where it's doing the work. So what I need to do is I need to get this whole surface to be consistent so that even the center area looks just like these edges. And that may take a little bit of time with 320 grit sandpaper. But I'll just sand back and forth. And one of the things I like to do is I like to change my position as I'm sanding every so often. And the reason for that is this sanding stroke is a repetitive sanding stroke. And if you stay in the same position and sanding with the same sanding action in your sanding stroke, if there's any sort of a flaw in your sanding stroke, it's repeated over and over and over, and that can be transferred to the surface you're sanding. So by changing your position every so often as you're sanding, you will cancel out that potential for error. It's also a good idea to flip your sanding block around and sand. And then of course, every so often I have to stop and clean off the sanding dust that has formed. So I just use my shop vac. And then I keep on going. After I fine-tuned the radius, I like to take some 220 grit sandpaper, wrap it around a small rubber eraser, and then knock back the sharp edges along the sides of the fretboard just to soften them up a bit. Then I'll work my way up through 600, 800, maybe 1200 grit sandpaper to get the surface of the fretboard as smooth as possible. And here I'm using super acrylic sanding abrasives, which do the job really well. Okay, so this is my setup that I use for pressing in frets. I've got a 1/2 ton arbor press, which I modified to accept a StewMac fret press call and a brass insert. You can get all different radius inserts to match whatever the radius of your fretboard is. And then I have a block of wood which I've drilled holes into, and they're all numbered so I can keep all my frets organized. And what I'll do is I'll take a length of fret wire, and typically what I'm using is Jescar fret wire that comes in these big rolls. And I will cut a piece to length using my handy Hosco. This is a TLFC 28S fret nipper that's specifically designed for that purpose. Works really well. I can cut the frets to length. Then I use a Cintum's fret tang nipper, and that's used to clip off the tang on each end, so that it stops short of the edge of the fretboard. And I do that because my slots stop short of the edge of the fretboard. They're often called blind fret slots. So it's like having a bound fretboard without actually having to use binding. It's the wood itself that acts as the binding. So it's a nice clean installation. And I always glue in my frets, and to do that I'm using thin CA glue. And you'll notice at the top here I have a tip that I've installed. This is a stainless steel tip. These are tips that are commonly used in the dental industry for applying adhesives. And the tips come in different sizes and they're color coded. This one in particular is a 25 gauge tip, so it fits into the slot nicely. And that allows me to precisely deposit the glue into the slot without making a big mess. And I'll apply the glue and it just sits in the slot. So it's not going to dry right away. I don't have to rush. But then I'll take my fret wire and I'll just set it into the slot. And then I will press it down into the neck, and I'll hold it for just a few, maybe 10-15 seconds, long enough for the glue to adhere to the fret tang and the wood. And then I'll just move on. The next thing I've got to do is clip off the excess fret wire where it extends beyond the edge of the fretboard. And some of these frets are pretty close to the edge, so there isn't a lot to snip off, and in some cases it won't snip off at all. But I'm going to use my Costco fret nipper to do the work. And if I can't get enough grip on the fret wire, I can turn the clipper on its side and clip off that excess. And I want to get as much off as I can. And what I like to do is place my fingers right in this area here and then carefully clip. I don't want to pinch my fingers, but I also don't want the piece that I clip off to go flying off somewhere. So I try to do it that way. And sometimes there's just not enough to grab onto as I snip them off. Let's see, there's a little piece there, so I'll just drop that in the trash. Now I have one more step that I need to do, and that is I want to bevel the edges of the frets, and it's always easier to do it before I have the body halves glued on. So I'm going to do that now, and I'm going to use my fret beveling tool, which is a block of wood that has a file, fret beveling file, installed at a 35-degree angle. And then I have a slab of, this is a Delrin plastic, and it's held in with wood screws that are countersunk into it. And this file will only file in one direction, and I've marked the top with an arrow so I can see quickly what direction I need to move the file. And I'll just simply begin Now, even though I said that this file only cuts in one direction, it does cut in the other direction as well, just not as efficiently. So you can go back and forth and speed up the process of forming that bevel. Now, of course, there are going to be people out there who will say, oh, you should never file in the wrong direction because you'll wear out the file faster. Well, I've been using this same file for hundreds and hundreds of guitar necks, and it's just as sharp today as it was, I think, when I bought it. Maybe a little bit duller, but it still does the job, and it will do it much faster. You can also vary your technique in how you form the bevel. For example, if you lay the file down flat, or the tool down flat so that the file is at a 35-degree angle, it may take a while to get that bevel formed. One way to speed it up is to tilt up the file so that it is parallel with the edge and perpendicular with the top. That will grind the fret back closer to the edge of the fretboard. And then you can gradually roll the tool over until it's flat on the surface. So you would start out like this, and you would end like this. That'll form that bevel faster. And it's also important to understand that from the 12th fret up to your last fret, whether it's 21, 22, 24, or whatever, it will take a little bit longer to form the bevel up here than it does down here. It's just, I think, because the frets are closer together. So it just takes more work to grind that material off. But you want to watch your progress, make sure you're not scraping off any of the fretboard itself. And then you just want to run your fingers along that edge to see what you're feeling in terms of the frets themselves. Now bear in mind, later on, these ends of the frets are going to be dressed. but I'm not going to do that now. I'll do that later on. I just want to get that bevel formed before I glue on the body halves because it's easier to do it right now. Well guys, that's all the time I've got for this episode, and what I'm going to be covering in part 10, the next episode, is I'm going to sand the contour of the neck, the headstock, as well as the halves of the body. And I'm going to do all that work before I glue the body halves to the neck, because it'll just be a lot easier to do the work. And once that's done, I can glue the body halves to the neck and continue from there. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you got something out of it, maybe some new ideas to help improve your process of installing frets. And as always, until the next episode, make sure that you click the thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel, again, welcome. I hope I've earned your subscription, and you can do that by clicking that subscribe button right now. And I will see you hopefully in the next episode. Take care.